Welcome back to the biggest developer you've never heard of. This is part 4, and I really recommend watching parts 1 to 3 because this is very quickly going to be an anticlimax for you otherwise. For those who just don't play by your rules, man, or have been here since the start, the developer is Distinctive Software, who, at the end of part 3, became EA Canada. This is a documentary with a game. Stand up, and you can sit down when you hear a game you've played. So far, you've sat down if you've ever played a test drive game, or several late 80s Sega ports, Hardball, Fight Night, Grand Prix Circuit, Bill Elliott's NASCAR Challenge, any of the 4D sports series including the one the Americans call Stunts, and several others, including the C64 version of Metal Gear. Yeah, Metal Gear, not Solid. Look, we explained this in part 3. So when we left DSI, they'd just become EA Canada, and their first job as part of EA was low-key, but will immediately grab a few of you who never played their driving games.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
Some will still insist this is the pinnacle of the NHL series. I'd make the case for the Mega Drive version of NHL PA 93, but this is the one that comes up most in retrospectives. The newly named EA Canada was starting low-key. They didn't write NHL 94 themselves, but handled the port to the Nintendo SNES. If you played that version, sit down. I suspect that's going to cover quite a lot of you who had a SNES. I might be biased, but NHL PA 93 on the Mega Drive remains one of my favourite games ever. But I think all the old 2D NHLs hold up against today's games massively better than their Madden or FIFA contemporaries. 94 is no exception. It's still a nice playable game and great for a single game boot up. It does have a singular distinction though, being the one game in the series where, possibly mindful of the incoming age ratings on games, EA removed the fighting. Fine by me, but a weird blip for ice hockey fans who really love a punching. A port to SNES wasn't a megaton start, but EA Canada's next act would be the first of 2 game series they created for EA. You might have heard of it. We've seen this first Need for Speed game before on Yesterzine, most notably when the 3DO came up. But yes, this too was created by DSI. That Need for Speed and Test Drive have the same creators is simultaneously both mind-blowing and really, really obvious to me. It becomes more obvious when you play the thing. We all know Need for Speed in 2020. This is the kind of thing it looks like.
This is the playground, the one they think they control. But when we create, they can't look away. They have to see. So I say watch. This is me.
It's all street racing neon dubstep spinny rims, and words missing most of their consonants. Also, CGI acting would make Command & Conquer blush.
Street racing has no place on public roads.
This first game is a little different in that regard. In fact, it's more of a lost test drive game than it is anything someone who came to the Need for Speed series in its current millennium would recognise. For a start, it's pitched more as a sim, licensing car data and receiving the endorsement from popular car magazine Road & Track. The official name of the game, in fact, is Road & Track Presents The Need for Speed. It's probably worth remembering at this point that only 5 years passed between Test Drive 2 and this, because it shows. This feels like a follow-up to that in a great many ways. Not least, it retains the dual mode, where you race a single other car through traffic and cop-filled stages. You have a small selection of current era supercars about which it loves to tell you as many specs as it can get its hands on. This is the first version, 1994's 3DO version, which feels even more test drive than the PlayStation and Saturn ports which came along a full 2 years later, once it was clear the 3DO was more of a dead end than the cemetery at the end of a cul-de-sac. The one everyone's played though is this, the PlayStation one. It's a smidge more cartoony than the 3DO in looks, maybe a touch more forgiving about me smacking it into the side, but it's basically the same thing. We've now got a full single race mode against multiple opponents. The car selection too is awfully familiar, with some names we've seen before in this series, including their attempt at the Diablo that only appeared in the versions of Test Drive 2 they weren't involved in. These days, these early texture 3D get driving games haven't aged super well. For all their age, the likes of Test Drive and Stunts are clear and have a decent enough draw distance. Games like Need for Speed 1, and it's by no means the worst offender, struggle with scaling their objects into the distance and maintaining detail, so the horizon, where you're going to want to look to survive, becomes something of a confused mess of coloured pixels. Meanwhile, the larger objects you're probably going to want to use as braking points have a nasty tendency to appear suddenly right on top of you. Still, this is a milestone of a game, even if it really should be thought of as the last DSI test drive game, rather than the first Need for Speed one in terms of its place in gaming history. After that first game, the road and track endorsement disappeared, and the series rapidly started to evolve more towards something we might recognise today. Even by the second game, some of the serious had dropped away. But first things first, I'm just going to play a little of this menu music, because it's quite possibly the first noises I ever heard a PlayStation make. Note, by the way, the EA Canada logo is already gone from the intro, and that the internal DSI Pioneer team are now identified only by their logo on one of the tracks. From this point on, pretty much anything DSI did was basically credited to various EA marketing constructs, which is a big part of why people don't realise how much they did. Playing a race in Need for Speed 2 immediately brings home the series' evolution. The handling's very drifty, the car sliding about like we've just gone ice racing. The tracks too are tighter and probably sillier. This route through an unspecified European mountain takes in a wooden bridge, half a theme park, the inside of a castle, dense forest coverage, and a trip through what I think is supposed to be an alpine village, all within a mile or two. There's also lots of bumps and hills designed to make the thing look spectacular and arcade. I have a tendency to always play sim games from an inside view and arcade ones outside. And it probably says as much as anything that about halfway through my first race in Need for Speed 2, I switched to the outside view without even really realising I'd done it, and I immediately started to do a lot better. There's nothing wrong with any of that, of course, it's just trying to be a different game now. If I describe Need for Speed 1 as the test drive game trying to be Need for Speed, then 2 is a Need for Speed game trying to keep on to some of its test drive roots. With the third game, the first of 3 Need for Speed games to carry the Hot Pursuit branding, it started being a lot more about running from the police, and the transition only accelerated. Need for Speed 2's biggest problem on reviews is that the cartoonier graphic style attracted the arcade crowd, but the physics hadn't been sufficiently loosened for them. The result was, at least in the magazines, a game that didn't really satisfy anyone. With the sim-minded people criticising the graphics, and the fact it was then too easy for them, and the arcade-minded people getting confused by needing to brake in a racing game that, to be fair, included a track where you had to avoid a giant plastic dinosaur. Around this time, Accolade decided to resurrect the Test Drive series, starting weirdly with an off-road spin-off, but very quickly moving to contracting the excellently named Pitbull Syndicate to produce a true Test Drive 4. It also wasn't super popular with magazines. Next Generation specifically laid into it. Had developer Pitbull done away with the hazards and just stuck to the driving, Test Drive 4 might have been a decent racer. As it stands, it's just another Need for Speed, and nobody needs that, not even EA. Given the history of both franchises, that's quite the irony. Playing Test Drive 4 though, it's certainly somewhere between the two Need for Speed games. It even defaults to the outside view as if it knows. While it's slidey, it's not so much so as Need for Speed 2, and the track's a little more consistent. If anything, it's already less silly than Need for Speed, so I don't quite follow those reviews. Whisper it, but with the extra weight in the handling of these cars and a more thought through experience, Test Drive 4 might have aged better than the early Need for Speed games have. There were a couple more official Test Drive entries, before the brand started being used on just about any driving game new owners Atari could get their hands on, sometimes absurdly to us British users. The American brand recognition meant that the games we know as V-Rally and Le Mans 24 Hour both got Test Drive designations in the US, as somehow did Driven to Destruction, the point at which you can probably officially assume the brand meant nothing in terms of its original ethos anymore. Thankfully, the series was just about saved in 2006 when it passed across to Eden Games, who produced the groundbreaking open world racer Test Drive Unlimited. In Xbox 360 form, it's my favourite game of all time, with its 1,000 miles of open Hawaiian road, and no doubt I'll write a eulogy to it some other time. Certainly, we have it to thank for Forza Horizon, which seems to steal more of its good ideas with every iteration. The final Test Drive game was a slightly disappointing, rapidly produced side project by Slightly Mad, also responsible for Need for Speed Shift, an also slightly disappointing attempt to get Need for Speed back to something resembling its roots. Test Drive Ferrari Legends appeared in 2012 and remains the final Test Drive, despite constant rumours of a reboot. Don't feel bad for Slightly Mad though, their next, quite literal Cars project worked out much better for them. EA Canada, meanwhile, were the custodians of Need for Speed through the fourth title, Road Challenge, aka High Stakes. Before, development was split for my personal favourite in the series, Porsche 2000, which Americans know as Porsche Unleashed, and the Germans just as Porsche, because they're that efficient. This one had a full 50-year Porsche career mode based around you having a job as their test driver. It's the last Need for Speed that feels in any way like its roots before sometime sister studio EA Black Box took over and went full nitros and neon, with 2003's Need for Speed Underground, the game which really set the series on the path to what we know today. EA Canada were responsible for the PC version of Porsche 2000, whereas the PlayStation one was farmed out to later Test Drive Unlimited developers Eden Games, making them yet another studio to somehow end up writing a game for both series. Alright, time to bring out the big guns. You may not have played either a Test Drive or Need for Speed, especially as DSI weren't involved in a lot of the later ones. But there's one more series EA Canada created that I think some of you might recognise. That got some of you, didn't it? Yeah, as Yesterday viewers, people who probably should get out more, and those who literally paid attention for the last 30 seconds will know, FIFA was originally written by Extended Play Productions. But here's the thing, Extended Play Productions was a new internal development team at, EA Canada. And they still are. They stopped using the Extended Play name somewhere between FIFA 97 and 98, but EA Canada has been responsible for every single FIFA game, including the FIFA Street series. If you have ever played any of them, you've played a Distinctive Software game. Also, it's fairly mind-bending that Test Drive, Need for Speed and FIFA were all created by the same developer. FIFA and Need for Speed, incidentally, are the 5th and 10th best-selling video game series of all time. I'm guessing I don't need to tell you about FIFA the game, right? If you want to know how those first ones hold up, may I point you at Yesterday episode 3? If you want to know what FIFA is like now, simply ask literally anyone under the age of 40. But what if football isn't your sport? Well, if you recall, we mentioned DSI's first job for EA was a port of NHL 94. It was not their last NHL involvement. In 1995, they did the PC version of NHL 96, the first NHL to use a vaguely 3D game engine. It was something of a test. By NHL 98, they'd taken over the whole franchise, and like FIFA, they still have it. It doesn't sell as well as FIFA, but that's another 1 million people a year playing DSI games, and I'm sure a few of you are sitting down having briefly been smug about the whole FIFA thing. But okay, football isn't your thing. Ice hockey isn't your thing. In fact, you don't do sports at all. In fact, the only EA Sports games you've ever liked are the ones that were published as EA Sports Big. So you think you're perfectly safe here. There's no way anyone like you played an EA Canada game, especially one that reintroduced the world to Run DMC.
EA Sports. Big.
This is gonna be very, very interesting.
Yeah, sorry. Snowboard Supercross, better known as SSX, was another standout series of the PlayStation 2 era. This is the middle one, SSX Tricky. They're downhill snowboard races with trick elements, and they perfectly grabbed what people were looking for in the extreme sports craze of the early 2000s. EA Canada were responsible for all the SSX games, except SSX Blur on Wii, which was made by EA in Canada, but not by EA Canada. It's a confusing situation that was recently rectified with another name change. EA Canada is now known as EA Vancouver. Although, given their name doesn't really appear in the games anymore, that's largely academic at this point. There's one more satellite we should take a look at, because they're responsible for a series that's a huge fan favourite, and several more of the Need for Speeds. We mentioned sometime sister studio EA Black Box, who spent the first and last years of their existence sharing space with EA Canada Prime. They did Hot Pursuit 2, Underground, Underground 2, The First Most Wanted, Carbon, Pro Street, Undercover, World, and The Run. Their greatest achievement, though, might instead be this, Skate, which despite not having had an entry since 2010 remains a huge fan favourite, not least for its endlessly exploitable physics engine, which fueled several years of early YouTubers' videos. No Skate since 2010 is a bit weird, to be honest. The series was a huge commercial success to the extent that 4 years after the release of Skate 3, EA had to order a new printing of the game. It was the most requested game to be added as backward compatible on Xbox One, which it duly was in 2016. And in 2018, EA took the somewhat rare decision to switch its online multiplayer servers back on, prompting speculation of a new instalment, which sadly so far has yet to come to fruition. Part of this is the official closure of Black Box in 2013, when the remaining personnel were merged into the parent studio. Need for Speed incidentally moved to Ghost Games in Europe at that point. You might wonder just how big EA Vancouver are now, given they pump out 2 huge yearly franchises alongside everything else. The answer is, really quite big. And in the final part next week, we'll show you just exactly how big, as we show you EA Vancouver as it is today, and catch up with the later stories of some of the people and companies we've mentioned in this series. Join me then.